Hi BookTube, it's Roz, and first thing I want to say is sorry for the slight lack of kind of video output over the last couple of weeks. Since I'm like fully back at work, I'm kind of struggling a bit with pain and lack of sleep from the recovering shoulder in just sort of doing the extras in my life as well as the basics. Fortunately, I consider reading as one of the basics, so I'm still doing plenty of that, but you're just hearing a bit less from me, but I'll try to keep building up. And what I wanted to do today was talk about a kind of feast of South American novels that I've read in April and at the beginning of May. And South America is a bit of a powerhouse at the moment for in literary terms, isn't it? Really some of the most interesting stuff coming out. In terms of contemporary writing, it seems to be from South American authors. That's my perspective anyway. Tell me if you disagree. I read a selection of things that are all sort of relatively recent, well, at least they are newly translated and, available in the UK in the last year, 2023-24. And they've all been interesting, and I'll kind of work through them, but the last two are probably the cream of the crop. Okay, so the first one that I read early in April was Undiscovered by Gabriela Wiener from Peru. It's translated by Julia Sanches. I talked about it in my People April wrap-up because it's kind of autofiction, so I won't say loads here. It's a bit of a mixed bag of a book for me. Bits that I found absolutely fascinating, bits that I found perhaps slightly irritating, though I think that was the author's intention. She was meaning to challenge us in our kind of reactions, I think. Definitely a memorable book, really into thinking about the aftermath of colonialism and sort of how that creates sort of conflicts about identity, amongst other things. Now, second South American book I read in April was from Argentina, a writer from Argentina, and that was Not a River by Selva Almada, and this one was a sort of undiluted delight. Well, I say delight, that's a funny way to talk about a book that is quite sort of intense and violent, but in terms of reading satisfaction and quality, I really loved Not a River. It's translated by, I must say, mustn't I, Annie McDermott, very good translator. And it's kind of the third book in a loose trilogy that Almada's written, that kind of about masculinity, about men. I know the second book in the trilogy, Brickmakers, was a very much admired book when it was translated into English, by sort of English language readers. And I've heard some people say they didn't enjoy or appreciate Not a River quite as much. I have to say I did. I really did. Actually, I thought it was brilliant. When you have those short books that are just so rich in ideas without seeming to say that much, that seem quite simple, but there's, enormous depths. It's about three friends who go on a fishing trip, and the landscape in which they're fishing is absolutely central to the story, as is sort of the feelings of the people who live there towards them. They're kind of like outsiders coming in. There's a sort of theme there around, exploitation or moving in on other people's land and using its resources, which is obviously, kind of interesting on a kind of metaphorical level for any country that's been colonized, but they're all Argentinian. They're not outsiders. It's really interesting on male desire, male friendship, and male violence, and the way Almada writes is quite sparse, and as I say, there is a lot of violence in there, and yet it is very, very sensitive. Great book. Yeah, warm recommendation. Now, the third thing from South America that I read in this period was Simpatia by Rodrigo Blanco Calderón, who's an author from Venezuela. I've never read anything by him before. It was translated by Noel Hernandez Gonzalez and Daniel Hahn, and it's a curious novel, this one. Again, short. It's about rescuing dogs in kind of like recent or contemporary Venezuela. It's I suppose it kind of uses that as almost a I don't know, like a kind of a way of writing about the upheaval and almost disintegration of Venezuelan society in the 20th century. You know, things in Venezuela have become very complex, very difficult. Lots of people leaving the country, and if they can, and one of the things they do is abandon their dogs. So that's the sort of the root of the story. But this is how to explain it. It's kind of about loyalty. It's about connection between people, but also about cruelty and betrayal, and then about survival. It's multi-layered. Sometimes it sort of became a little disjointed, but I found it probably the most revealing thing that I read about Venezuela and the trials and tribulations in Venezuela, whilst focusing on rescuing dogs, sort of. There we go. Now, the last two things that I read from South America in this period were both from Brazil, or authors from Brazil, as it happens. And as I say, I think these two were probably the cream of the crop. I don't know. I did love Not a River as well. The first was Of Cattle and Men by Paula Maia, translated by Zoe Perry. And like Simpatia, it's a kind of a combination of something that is intensely realist with something that is quite metaphorical. It brings those two things together, which is very much what happened in Simpatia. This is sort of, it works on both those levels, I suppose, and so does Of Cattle and Men. Now, Of Cattle and Men is what it says on the tin. It's about, its characters are almost all either animals or men, not women. There's some desperate women in a crowd, but the named characters are all male, and it's set in and around a slaughterhouse in rural Brazil. It's a very brutal book. I've heard some people say, well, they wouldn't want to read it because it's about killing animals. Well, yes, it is. That's the point. So, well, if you don't read that, that's okay. But, I hope if in that case you don't eat meat, because, that would be very hypocritical. It's quite violent, but also has a kind of mysterious quality. There are strange, mysterious in terms of what's going on, mysterious in terms of the characters. We sort of see their actions, but struggle to understand them in their hearts, and yet they seem to be, lots of them trying to do the right thing, or trying to achieve sort of honor or dignity in some way in a sort of position of great sort of economic uncertainty. I suppose in a way it's about what does killing animals, a life spent, a job, or a life spent based around slaughter of animals, what does that do to people, to a person, to a human being? And equally, what does, a sort of a life centered around killing animals do to a place, to a landscape, to an ecosystem? It's yeah, it has hints of a horror novel about it. There is definitely something odd going on with the cattle. Like they almost develop a death wish. But ultimately the reality of slaughter of animals is horror enough. So it doesn't go right down the kind of horror route. Really interesting book. I think it won the Republic of Consciousness Prize for books from small presses, and a worthy winner, I think, and absolutely something that I'm very glad to have read. It's one of those things we slightly hesitate to say, do read this, because it is so brutal and odd. But nevertheless, I would say, if you can stomach that, do. Which brings me to the last of these books, and that was Crooked Plow by Itamar Vieira Jr., translated by Johnny Lorenz. Another excellent translator. He's translated Clarice Lispector. Very fine. And this is quite a complex book to try and do justice to in a short review, and I'm trying to keep this short. It's set in the Bahia, is that how you pronounce it? Region of Brazil, which is a poor rural area where the majority of the population is descended from enslaved Africans who were, brought to Brazil against their will and worked on plantations there. And when slavery ended in 1888, the majority of those people then just moved over to being indentured labourers, agricultural workers, that are working in a bit like sharecropping. They're working on the plantations in order to have the right to have a home and a little farm or garden of their own on that land. No pay, no rights, no nothing, and it looks at it looks at their relationship with the indigenous population, but how also they all continue to be controlled and exploited by a sort of settler European strand of Brazilian society. So it's a historical novel that goes from sort of it feels like it's starting back in the 19th century, but it isn't. It's sort of well into the 20th century when this novel starts, and it brings up sort of into the late 20th century at least, but it feels further back in time because of the partly the way it's written, but partly because of the lives of the characters and their experiences. I mean, this is a book about desperate poverty and violence, and how people find love and find ways to try and survive in that sort of environment of exploitation and poverty and violence. But may express that men may turn to violence against women to sustain their self-esteem or something, to have control over something. It draws on, interestingly, the author, he draws on a kind of what feels like a sort of oral storytelling tradition, as well as a sort of Brazilian literary tradition. I mean, you think of the novels of Jorge Amado from the sort of middle of the 20th century, say, that are set, in the same part of Brazil. There's a strong element in the book that is around the sort of traditional religious beliefs of Afro-Brazilians that are based on sort of elements brought across from Africa and then kind of took on a life of their own and were key to holding communities together and to sort of like traditional medicine and so on. Yes, but it looks at kind of political struggle, but growing political awareness, fight for land rights, the fight to get education, the fight for change. So very multi-layered. What carries you through the book, though, is the characters, the two sisters that are central to the story, and the people around them. Very memorable, very engaging, unusual, but fascinating characters that draw you through what is quite an unusual novel. Several of these books are were on the long list or the short list for the International Booker, and I know Crooked Plow is on the short list, and I would be delighted if this one were to win. I think it's a first novel, and it's a book of real quality in the way it's written, in the emotions and ideas that it engenders. It's a beautiful, sad book, and do read it. There you go. What a joy I've had with my South American reading these past few weeks. I will at some point do a wrap up of my May reading altogether, April reading altogether. I've talked about People April, I've talked about these, but I'll try and do something that sort of pulls my highlights for the month together before May the following month is out. And I hope you're having a brilliant time reading in May.